It's difficult to launch a startup without technical talent on the team. Investors, please. Give us a few $100,000. We'll do some research and maybe something good will come out of it.
Experience in startups helps you view the world of corporate governance from a different perspective.
Advisory board or board members should bring more to the table than just the kind of advice you could get from Gemini or ChatGPT. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Board of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel. Today we continue our discussion about boards and startups. Oleg, when a board is created in corporate business, the first step is usually its composition, which depends on the current state of the business, its strategy, and its strategic objectives. Essentially, the composition of the board is designed to bridge the gap between the expertise that already exists within the business and the expertise required to achieve its strategic goals. This is how the board structure is formed, and then candidates with the relevant expertise are sought out. How does this work in startups?
From my experience, I've seen that once a startup receives its first round of investment, the investor typically wants greater control and visibility into what's happening. In many cases, the investor may recommend business professionals who can add value. In addition, over the past few years, there has been a strong growth of acceleration programs where startups can run tests and validate ideas. There, they also receive additional training, networking opportunities, and in most cases, they work with mentors. As a result, I noticed that many people who end up on advisory boards or in other customized board structures tend to be mentors. If trust is established, if there's a sense that long-term collaboration is possible, and if value or specific contributions are recognized, these relationships can develop into ongoing partnerships with the startup, or it can be straightforward networking. For example, when one startup asks another, "We've already gone through this stage, whether it was entering a certain market or securing funding. Can you recommend someone who could help us?" Or perhaps, "We're looking for a product advisor who can help make our strategy more compelling and focused." In that sense, it's often word of mouth that helps identify the right person to join a board.
In practice, how often does the need for new expertise actually arise?
It could easily be every 6 months, sometimes even more frequently, depending on the function. For instance, in product development, the required expertise may vary depending on whether the focus is on a specific country or a particular market segment. Startups often pivot. For example, they might realize they don't need to expand into Latin America, but instead should concentrate on Europe, which means they now need European market expertise. Or perhaps they originally targeted the B2B market, but discovered it was more complex, time-consuming, and required licensing or data protection measures. In such cases, they might start testing B2C, which creates a need for someone experienced in running social media campaigns to help spend very limited resources effectively. That's why this can emerge very quickly. Core corporate functions such as HR, operations, and finance typically don't need to change very often. For example, you might have the same person overseeing finance for several years, but when it comes to marketing, sales, business development, or product, the need for new expertise can arise much more frequently.
Considering that founders or project initiators are usually not business people, but rather individuals with a technical background and technical way of thinking, how common is it that the team, and especially the owners, are not really prepared to collaborate with a board?
This is indeed a recurring issue. Another challenge is mistrust, especially if board members are brought in at different times, where some owners select certain members while others choose different ones. As a result, when it comes to voting, there can be suspicion that someone is simply voting in alignment with the person who invited them, rather than based on objective criteria, since there's often no consistent system for evaluation. In addition, if agreements among the founders are not clearly formalized, issues can arise. For example, they may recall an informal agreement from last year about the company's strategy, but since it wasn't documented or voted on, others may now want to change direction. Or take the case where one founder invites an advisor and negotiates slightly different terms. This can lead to disputes such as, "Why are we paying this from our budget?" These kinds of discussions often occur, and unfortunately, or fortunately, in most technology startups, the founders either have strong technical expertise, but not business expertise, or they rely on their networks and vision to drive strategy while lacking the operational capacity needed to execute. They often don't fully realize how difficult, time-consuming, and important certain functions can be, for example, HR. As a result, they may neglect some areas simply because we need a presentation right now, or in the next funding round, no one told us this was required, so we won't bother with it. That's why more advanced, more thoughtful startups tend to listen to the corporate segment a little more and say, "Okay, please help us identify what we really need to focus on. Like, what's a must?" And then regarding everything else, they'll consider it later depending on what resources are available.
Sergiy, a question. Oleg, and I have a somewhat provocative question for you too. This isn't even a question, but rather a statement. There is a clear difference between classical boards and startup boards. In the first part, we mentioned that one such difference is the need for additional operational involvement. When execution resources are lacking, board members are expected to directly contribute to implementing the decisions that are made. This also happens in SMBs, but there it's more or less assumed simply because there aren't enough people to cover all the specialized functions. Another major difference that comes to mind is the very idea of independence. If a board member is brought in by a founder, there's often a suspicion that they'll simply vote in line with that founder. Whether this person can truly provide an independent perspective? When a board is formed by a chair, for example, from individuals who have had no prior connection with either the business or the founders, that in itself establishes the very idea of independence, the foundation on which corporate governance is built. And on this basis, you get a dialogue between the dependent and the independent sides, with the independent members openly expressing their views and standing by their decisions. At the startup stage, however, a board usually cannot yet afford to have a chair who builds such an independent platform, a platform for truly independent thought. These are important elements: operational involvement, as we mentioned earlier, and an independent foundation for board discussions and decision-making. But is this really a board? It may be the case that at this stage,
Yes.
what in startup language is called the pre-seed stage,
Or even seed, where the first funding has been raised, but the company has not yet reached operational break-even. In other words, it's not yet the next scaling round, not a Series A or beyond.
So you could say it's a kind of pre-seed stage and also a pre-board stage, right? Because you really can't call it a proper board instrument if there's no independence of thought. So what balance is there, really?
To be honest, I haven't seen truly independent boards in startups, even in cases where, say, there are two co-founders with roughly equal stakes. One of them becomes CEO for balance, the other chairs the board. But in practice, both are still directly involved in management, and together with the other co-founders, they decide who gets invited to join the board. And frankly, this is a matter of maturity. I haven't seen any real demand for independent boards in startups. The logic is usually, until we raise significant funding, what matters most is efficiency. Anything perceived as slowing down efficiency is set aside for the time being. Later, when more investors come in, they need to protect their interests, reduce potential conflicts, and ensure proper balance. That's the stage after operational efficiency has been proven, once scaling begins and the company valuation reaches the millions, where independent board members start to appear. That's the common practice seen in international markets when a major investor joins and secures a board seat. At that point, the board seat might be taken by either an independent professional or a representative of the fund. But unfortunately, at the pre-seed and seed stages, it's rarely about independence, it's about efficiency. If you're not efficient, it's simply goodbye. Even though many people do understand the value of independent thinking, unfortunately at this stage, there's just no real mechanism for it.
Yes, because best practices in corporate governance clearly state that there should be independent board members, ideally with an independent chair, meaning someone not tied to the founders or to operational management.
That's we haven't really seen in practice. The reality is that resources are very limited, and there's often a lack of trust that someone from outside the startup truly understands the business or the technology, and that they wouldn't just give generic advice, the kind that, as I mentioned earlier, AI can already provide. After all, AI can design the perfect board structure, build governance frameworks, draft protocols, or even sketch out a strategy. What the CEO really needs is execution. That is the constant request from startup CEOs. They don't always want to see anything beyond what feels like a customized ChatGPT, whereas an advisory board should function more like the muscle that helps actually get things done.
Which is why advisory board or board members must bring more than just the kind of advice you could already get from Gemini or ChatGPT. And that's absolutely right. In fact, board members today face competition, not only with each other, but also with artificial intelligence.
Which raises an interesting question, maybe for our next discussion. To what extent can ChatGPT's perspective actually be considered independent? After all, it is built on data gathered from the outside world. One way or another, it's still a kind of bubble, larger or smaller, but it collects data from the external environment. The key question is, how independent is the opinion it provides about the business that is asking?
It can be independent, yes, but inevitably it is limited by the information it's working with. In reality, people participating in discussions or voting are also limited by the knowledge and experience they have. In that sense, you could argue that AI has the advantage. But the fact that AI will later use the information obtained from a startup's query for other projects, that's essentially public. In practice, yes, this should, in theory, make the startup's CEO more cautious. For example, if they keep using AI through a regular ChatGPT account, rather than specialized subscriptions that restrict information use.
So yes, risks exist, but again, resources are limited. People don't always prioritize prioritize security. The standards of information security are often lower, hiring processes less structured, and data access less regulated. So yes, there's a lot. In general, startups face a huge number of issues that need to be addressed, but dependency on first securing funding and testing hypotheses always comes first. Everything else is secondary. As the saying goes, you don't put up wallpaper in a house that's on fire. Another point, when someone has experience in both worlds, startups and corporates, sometimes you look at their decisions and think, how is that even possible? But then you see the pitch, the investment raised, and you go, okay, maybe I just don't get it. And then you move on. If asked, we'll do it. If not, please, don't fix what isn't broken.
Step by step.
Step by step, what's needed is a certain methodology, an IT agile flexible model, both in development and in management. I'd also say there's value in understanding what advice larger enterprises and SMBs can offer to startups, but it should be treated more as guidance rather than strict rules to follow. Overall, it's very useful when startups have people from traditional corporate business. For those individuals, it's also highly valuable. They can bring back insights to drive internal innovation, create entrepreneurial ventures, and in turn, startups eventually start listening to them as well. So it becomes an exchange of experience, but without unnecessary interference. And trust still needs to be built over time.
Especially considering that board members also get involved in professional matters within startups. What's the typical time commitment for serving on one board?
To be honest, in several startups I've seen, no one has ever really discussed it. It tends to work out informally, and in most cases, the actual time commitment depends on the burn rate, how quickly the startup is running through its cash. So all participants in the process understand that if there's funding for 6 months, the commitment is likely for 6 months as well. That said, while I have seen formal contracts, they usually run for about 6 months to a year. I haven't seen longer-term contracts because by nature a startup isn't really a long-term environment. In SMEs, it's probably a bit different.
Board members, of course, have other commitments beyond a single startup. How much time per month does one startup take?
As I mentioned, it can vary depending on how much time the individual has available. But at minimum, it's usually 1 to 2 hours per week, since there are general meetings, plus some work requested by the founders or the CEO. So I'd estimate around 2 to 3 hours per week of engagement for a startup board member. It can certainly be more, but unlikely to be less.
Startups have incubators. As I understand it, incubators help startups pass that initial filter on the way to securing their first investment. They provide some degree of basic structuring, knowledge exchange, and preparation. In your view, is there anything in the incubator's role that later gets carried over by boards once the business is more mature? Or are there aspects of incubator support that typically fall outside the board's competence?
Potentially, yes, especially if incubators or accelerators provide broad access to mentors. That way, startups can connect with people who support them not just during the formal program, but beyond. Incubators are also where startups test their ideas. Almost as a standard, they prepare presentation slides, so-called investment pitch decks, focused on their product or service. But they often lack the resources to conduct high-quality market research, nor do they always understand how to establish contact with funds. So at times, it looks like the first stage, Yanam accelerators and incubators, has done its job. There are demo days where startups pitch, but only a small fraction actually secures funding. This can be a grant, direct funding, or other financial support. Then there's a very big gap before the startups that have started gaining traction, getting some clients, or having people reach out to them. And in that gap, many startups fail. They feel emotionally encouraged, someone told them they're great, they got positive feedback, but then they can't make the next step. That next step usually means marketing, sales, or real customer engagement. If they don't manage to bring in at least some business partners or clients, they often end up shutting down. Those that survive realize we need more marketing, more business development, more product focus, and they actively start searching for that. And even without resources, they try to communicate, to help out, to network, to give advice, and so on. Unfortunately, from the perspective of grant funding and well-structured accelerators or incubators, often the ability to just present their project well is already seen as a success. But after the next few years, it gets much harder. And without business people, this next stage is simply not possible. So either mentors help informally, or there's an advisory board, or the company quickly forms a board and starts moving forward. If not, it's nearly impossible to progress, because business experience and connections matter. For example, if it's a B2B startup, you need to understand the industry, know the decision makers, and at least be able to conduct a proper interview. Some are developing products, say for HR functions or for other corporate needs, and at minimum you need mentors or advisors to make those introductions. Otherwise, with all due respect, it looks like just a group of students trying to reach out to, say, the HR director of Aurora Multimarket. But if there's a business person saying, we've got a solid opportunity here, let's set up a call, that's a very different level. You could substitute another company as an example, but the point is the same. Without advisors or a functioning board, it's very hard to achieve meaningful business results.
How common is it in practice that board members also act as investors in a startup?
I've heard this is quite common in other countries, but unfortunately, it's not very widespread in ours. For me, that's actually an indicator of how much confidence advisors have in a particular startup. From what I've seen, this is more about investment in the startup itself, not compensation to board members. Meaning, it's not always them putting in money up front, but rather agreeing to work with the startup. For example, saying, all right, for a year, I won't take any payment unless any funding around $1,000 comes in. If it doesn't, I'll count it as time invested and experience gained. So it's not considered mandatory to get paid. But I haven't heard of many cases where advisors themselves actually buy equity. This is also related to the fact that many founders think their startup is already worth millions or tens of millions, a guaranteed unicorn. So they're reluctant to sell even a small share for what they see as just a few $1,000s. That's why it's important to do research here. It's a very interesting dynamic.
There can be a certain excessive optimism from founders regarding the valuation of their business.
And there's the additional effect that they often don't fully understand business realities. They don't realize how difficult it is or what competencies are required. They imagine potential millions in future transactions and wonder, why should your advice, even just a few hours a month, cost equity or a percentage of those future millions? That mindset is also part of the issue.
By the way, Oleg, would you agree that most startups are founded by technical people?
Well, yes, at least 50% are engineers or developers. It's very hard to start a startup without technical talent on the team.
True, but if in the early stages there's a lack of industry experts, then a lot of the hypotheses these technical founders propose don't hold up in real life, because without business people validating that there's an actual market need, the engineers simply assume this can be built, this can be solved. But the real question is, does anyone actually need this solution? Then they go through pre-seed, demo days, pitching, and eventually they bring in industry experts who tell them there's no such demand in the market. Could that happen?
Absolutely. In fact, I'd say around 80% of startups end up in that exact situation. And here's the thing. Since so many founders are technical, they can build almost any product and start testing it, simply because they find it interesting. Most of their pitches sound like, we want to build this thing, we're really excited about it. But then they say, we need a few $100,000 to explore it further. Please, investors, give us a few $100,000, we'll do some research and maybe something good will come out of it. From an investor's perspective, this often looks a bit ridiculous. Essentially, it's just give us the money so we can keep doing what we enjoy, but don't expect us to focus on sales or the business side. Right now, this is very common in the wave of speculation around large language models and AI. The argument is, well, we need to train the model so it can do something useful. Well, of course, the technology needs to be trained. That'll take 6 months and $500,000. When I hear these kinds of requests, maybe it's just me being old school, but my immediate reaction is, okay, this is going to be very difficult to pull off. Most startups seem to expect huge amounts of money already at the MVP stage, without validating their hypotheses or even trying to make early sales and conducting proper customer interviews. Because in reality, based on all the training, experience, and best practices from programs like Y Combinator and others, you need at least 50 in-depth customer interviews just to start understanding the industry where you're trying to introduce your product. But what most startups do is talk to 2 or 3 people and then claim, we've got tons of insights. They'll say, these people told us it's a pain point, they're ready to use something. But then you look at the unit economics and, for example,
do you have some cases in mind?
Sure, take the example of a mobile app that people would only use once every few months. Founders often say, there's no app for this service yet, so let's build one. But logically, you wouldn't install an app for something you only use once a quarter. Why would you? Nobody does that, and if they try, chances are it simply won't work out. Okay, fair enough. And then, of course, there are plenty of similar cases now with artificial intelligence. There are some very curious cases. For example, using a photograph to predict how well a person will perform at work, just from a photo. For me, that already crosses an ethical line from a corporate perspective.
A facial photo?
It's a bit like those old criminological theories about how someone's face determines their character. Something along those lines. People say, we need to train a model for this, it's exciting. But personally, I wouldn't invest in such things either.
Oleg, what recommendations would you give to early-stage startup founders or to potential board members joining startups? What are the best practices for this kind of work, and what are the most common mistakes?
There's a lot of experience to draw on here, especially in terms of mistakes and what can be done better. First of all, I would recommend thinking a bit about design, mapping the skills of your founders and team, and identifying where external support will be needed. It doesn't always mean you need to form a board immediately, but at the very least you should recognize which skills you won't realistically acquire in the short or medium term and plan to bring them in from outside. I would also prioritize advisors who can help with fundraising, because if there's no money, you simply won't have the time to structure everything else. A big part of this is calculating both time and money, understanding how the work can actually be done. As was rightly said earlier, there needs to be an agreement between founders and the team on how work will be organized and how decisions will be made. If someone wants to continue separately, that has to be clear. If there's no alignment on how to prioritize projects given limited resources, that quickly becomes a problem. I would spend some time upfront on design and on documenting agreements, because once the board appears, it's not always easy to retroactively structure things. Often the board moves fast, and after some time issues begin to emerge. Having a board can be great. It allows you to hear multiple sides and build a more balanced position, but it's far better if there are clear agreements already in place. Because as time passes, a few years in, founders may start to see not only the future differently, but even the past.
And when the money comes in?
Money is always a trigger point. Once numbers come into play, people start calculating. Previously, it didn't seem to matter much. For example, saying, let's allocate 10% to the team. It felt like no one would really notice it anyway. Owners would say, advisors are asking for 1%. And fine, 1% didn't sound like much either. But then, once they received the first tranche and saw the valuation, say, selling 10% of shares for 300 to 400K, implying a company valuation of several $1 million, suddenly it all became very real. Now every single percent counts. Each percent translates into hundreds of thousands of dollars. That raises the question, why should I hire, for example, a sales director and give away part of that? This is where more conflicts start to arise, followed by voting and disagreements. That's why I'd structure and negotiate it more like a prenuptial agreement, something clearly set out from the beginning. It's a standard business practice, and it's important to pay attention to it. I also think it's very useful, before jumping into launching your own startup, to first observe how it actually happens in practice. Today, there are plenty of opportunities to join and watch how acceleration programs run, how hackathons are launched, and generally how the whole process works behind the scenes. You can also take on a role as an advisor or board advisor in other startups, contributing in a specific function such as development, marketing, or something else. With more exposure and hands-on experience, you can start in a more structured way. Unfortunately, and I'll sound a bit negative here, but if you look at official statistics on how many startups over the past 5 years received support and managed to move to the next stage, actually reaching operational profitability, securing funding, and continuing to grow, the percentage is quite small. Most, unfortunately, don't survive. That's why I believe it's important to prepare and understand what can realistically be done.
I'd also add another point for discussion. We often receive requests from very experienced managers and top executives who want to build a career on boards, meaning in corporate governance. Many experts suggest that NGOS can be a very good first step to test yourself and build a track record in governance. And startup boards can also serve as an excellent entry point into building such a career. I would
strongly recommend starting there. It's not necessary to take on multiple projects at once, but at least one pet project can be very valuable. Every expert or top manager can find something interesting happening in their industry. That's why I say it's important to look around, see what startups are out there, what ideas are being tested, and get involved. Even if a project closes in 6 months, it will still be a very meaningful experience. It shows that the person continues learning, works in the dynamic startup ecosystem, and engages with exciting sectors. For example, defense tech, dual-use technologies, or expertise-driven startups targeting international markets. Personally, I found that experience from startups can later be applied in corporate education, giving a much stronger understanding of how to implement innovation. In SMBs, board members also work with innovation and need to evaluate investment projects. If they have this kind of startup experience to draw upon, they can be much more effective. So yes, I think it's a very good board.
We once had a discussion about digitalization, how boards influence business transformation through new IT solutions and modernization of approaches in general. And here I see a real intersection. Someone with startup experience, having worked in several ventures before starting a corporate governance career, can add a lot in the digitalization sphere for SMBs or even large companies. That startup perspective helps them look at corporate governance from a different angle. It might not bring immediate profit, but acquiring that experience is accessible, and it provides a practical pathway for top executives who want to move into governance.
Absolutely. The experience I mentioned earlier was very interesting for me. Unfortunately, it happened mostly before the full-scale invasion. These were what you might call corporate hackathons. For example, banks or companies like MHP would bring together startups that could develop solutions relevant to their industries. They had the opportunity not only to invest in those startups, but also to bring them on as contractors, or even hire the teams directly. I also recall Huawei doing something similar last year, a corporate internal hackathon, where they gathered innovative teams. This kind of experience can then be applied by top management internally, launching internal innovation projects or corporate startups, where ownership stays with the company, but a share can go to the initiative taker driving the idea. I should also mention what are now called venture builders, companies that exist to create other companies. A good example is Genesis's ecosystem, which includes the Scalar venture builder. They currently run 14 or more startups, each led by managers responsible for the internal venture. As I understand it, the majority of equity stays with the venture builder, but the CEOs of those startups still receive a meaningful stake. They also leverage shared resources and collective expertise to support these ventures, essentially building an in-house startup farm based on internal capabilities. I'm certain that large companies will eventually start doing something similar.
Okay, that's very interesting about this corporate hackathon, but what if the company isn't as big as KMHP, let's say, a company that's not M but S, a medium-sized business? Is there an individual approach where a company can go to an accelerator or incubator and say, this is the industry I'm in, can you recommend relevant startups for me to engage with and perhaps explore potential collaboration? For startups, right after a demo day, this is often their first real contact with business, and for companies that aren't giants like MHP or Kyivstar, it's a chance to see what's happening outside of their traditional offline operations, to look outward at innovation.
I would strongly encourage this. Whenever a company wants to test something new, this can be the way. There are now plenty of accelerators and incubators, as well as opportunities to secure grants. A company can create a pilot project led either by the owner or one of the managers.
Or from the board.
The configuration can be flexible, setting up a structure around the idea or even building an MVP. Such a project can also leverage the company's existing intellectual property and to showcase what already exists, but to show that this is separately a broader solution to the issue. The project gets tested. Mentors in the accelerator react to it, investors give their feedback. And if the feedback is positive, the team can return to their company and say, this is no longer just our idea. We've validated it against established standards and frameworks. We even won first, second, or third place and received this kind of feedback. The feedback from mentors or the jury provides guidance, showing that the idea can be developed into a standalone business direction and even positioned for additional investment. That's why I see real value in this approach. Board members, in fact, could take the lead in championing such external testing of investment ideas and then bring them back inside.
This is especially valuable because each board member often brings their own hypotheses about different scenarios and business models. Such testing allows those hypotheses to be validated. The startup ecosystem is a great testing ground, a platform where these ideas and hypotheses from individual board members or from the board as a whole under its chair can be tried out. Absolutely, it's a win-win.
Beyond this, the relationship is two-way. Corporate boards can contribute methodology, governance practices, and structured approaches that benefit startups, while startups can bring something fresh and innovative back to corporate boards. Startups can offer new ways of thinking, greater flexibility and innovation, all of which are highly valuable for large corporate boards.
That's why I recommend paying attention to this space overall. It's not only about ideas, but also about inspiration. And importantly, it's also about talent. There's a significant demand for skilled people today. Engaging with this environment is also a way to spot individuals who have the energy and drive to make things happen. These people have already gone through a journey, which makes it much more effective to strengthen your own teams by offering collaboration or even hiring them. Plus, you stay up to date with ongoing developments, technological trends, and what's happening in the industry. In some cases, if it's not protected intellectual property but simply an idea, a company with the right resources can replicate it. That allows you to implement it faster while also observing how jury members, mentors, and other participants or stakeholders react. This helps you assess whether the idea truly works or whether it's just a hypothesis that still needs further validation.
Oleg, Armen, thank you very much for this exchange of views and for the discussion. It was both interesting and very insightful.
I'm grateful for such an engaging conversation. I believe it's exactly at the intersection of what might seem like entirely different worlds, different universes, even where we find the energy that drives industries forward. So Oleg, thank you again for the insights.
Thank you as well for the meeting and the dialogue. I'm moving from the startup world into the corporate world, so I'm sure we'll continue to meet somewhere at that intersection. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. See you on Boards of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel.